Welcome to another episode of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about the skills we need to build healthy relationships with others. Today's show is about the way we create ideas in our mind about how life works and about how we can expect things from people. These ideas are sometimes called a belief system, and they come generally from our life experiences. This belief system that we have and we create, we often are unaware of, and thus can sometimes create conflict in our relationships, or at least frustration for us. I recently was reminded of how this works when I was playing with my 15-month-old grandson. We had just introduced a new ball that we gave to him, and we were playing catch with it. And we were trying to get him to say the word ball. So each time we would throw, we'd say, "This is a ball." And eventually, with time, he began to say ball. Later on, however, I noticed that he started to call anything that was round a ball. So an orange became a ball. An egg became a ball. Even my bald head became a ball.
Oh no.
So although this is sort of a simplistic example of how we can wrongly attribute some characteristic of someone or something to others in error, obviously anything round must be a ball to the child there. This phenomenon of overgeneralizing occurs in adults as well. And it's much more complex, so forth. So, Marsha, could you kind of share with our viewers how this changes from a child mistaking the ball for and overgeneralizing it to what we do as adults?
Sure. So today's show, we're talking about assumptions when it boils down to things. And we want to make sense of the world. And in the absence of objective explanations, we make assumptions. And we attribute causes to the actions, and we make assumptions, we draw conclusions about intentions and attitudes and motivations.
So this is a normal process.
It's normal. It has helped us survive. Unfortunately, some of our ability to make assumptions, which served us when we were more primitive, have to do more with social situations, and it doesn't quite adapt. And so we make mistakes. We think that we know more than we really know. And we think that we don't fall prey to the same things that everybody else does. We think we're above of those common mistakes of like, I know why somebody did something. And like,
so I wouldn't do that.
I wouldn't be prone to making a misjudgment about something. So what we do is we scan our environment and we try to figure out what's going on. We know how to react, if it's friendly, if it's not friendly, and how to behave.
So we sort of make a logic for us out of the situation.
As much as we can from the scant information that we might be using. So when we skim and scan the environment and the situation that we're in, we basically break things into two categories. And we attribute people to doing things either because of their disposition, their internal character, the aspects like about themselves,
their personality,
like their breeding, whatever it is, their education, about things that are traits, personal traits, the inside. Or we say it's because of the situational environment, the context. So it's either character or context. Some internal aspects and traits, or things pressing from the outside.
So when something happens, we go either in one of those directions, you're saying?
Typically.
To try to make sense of why this happened.
Exactly. And what is most interesting is that when we are assessing other people's behavior, we are more inclined to attribute their motivation to some kind of personal trait, internal character aspect.
Or a deficit in their character.
Or, well, usually, yeah. But whatever, it's because, particularly if it's a negative behavior, we'll say it's because they are that way. However, when we are explaining our own behavior, our own possibly negative behavior, we are typically going to defend ourselves because there were external reasons. It wasn't because I'm a whatever. It's because of this and this and this that was beyond my control.
So we're more generous when
Absolutely.
we're explaining our own
Exactly.
actions.
And in part, that could be because we know more information about our situation.
Okay.
And we know very little information about the other person's situation. And that can contribute to it.
So we take the shortcut.
We do. It's a very shortcut. And so that would be fine if we then followed up with clarifying questions. But that is not what we are inclined to do. In fact, we will react to our conclusions. And we've judged this behavior, and then we react based on that judgment. And it's based on quick, often casual or superficial information, certainly incomplete information, because we haven't asked for clarifying questions, like why did you do that, or why?
Just assume.
We just assume. We make assumptions. There is a fancy name for this, and I'm going to tell you what it is. It's the fundamental attribution error, is what it's called. But that's hard to keep in your head. It's basically just you're making a quick assumption about somebody's behavior based on a little bit of information, and you're more generous in explaining perhaps even the very same behavior in yourself, attributing it to external reasons rather than internal reasons. Whereas we will say it's a character flaw in the other person.
So if I came late to a meeting, I could say, well, there was traffic, I didn't count on that, and so forth. So of course I should be excused for that. But if somebody else came, well, they should know. They don't have much investment in this.
They're irresponsible, they're bad time management, they're lazy, they're inconsiderate, they're not thoughtful, and it's as if they did it intentional. We assume that negative behavior in other people was planned and intentional, whereas we believe ours was situationally driven and excusable.
Right. So I'm really going after their character when I'm doing that rather than...
Because we don't know what the story is.
Right.
So we jump to a quick conclusion.
Okay.
And it's a tendency that we all do. So today we're trying to say, hey, for lack of full story and full information, be aware that you may be jumping to a conclusion that is slanted in against somebody. So, and particularly if you are coming from different cultures, different ages, different economic classes, or just in general from a different group where you have different lived experiences, you're going to draw conclusions on experiences that you've had that are different from that other group.
Right. I would think it too could be perhaps self-reinforcing in the sense that once I've concluded this, rather than looking for a different explanation, I continue with that explanation and more behavior is interpreted in that way? Is that fair to say?
I would say that's very fair because we are comfortable with our conclusion. We don't test it. We don't necessarily. We're going to encourage people to test their conclusions, but we don't. We think, aha, that makes sense, and we don't look beyond. So we've talked in other shows about love languages as well, and this might be a place where somebody does something or doesn't, the omission of doing something, and you have calibrated expectations.
Right.
Because of my expectations, you don't fulfill my expectations.
So if I had a love language of affection was my love language, I could wrongly assume or attribute that same quality to my partner, and that's not your love language at all. Therefore, I keep walking into this wall of resistance because I'm assuming something.
And I'm also assuming that you know what I need and that you're not living up to it. So this is an assumption that we should be aware of. Fundamental attribution error. We are attributing people's behavior, motivations, and attitudes to internal characteristics that may or may not be the reason that they're behaving in the way they are. And we excuse ours away and we defend ourselves because it's not about us. So that's one thing. Another tendency we have about assumptions is if things go well, we assume that the contributions and the influence that we had on it is perhaps greater than it really was.
What caused it?
We
or
are
something?
quick to jump to the conclusion that we made something good happen. However, if things did not go well, we will step back from that and we will attribute it again to external factors or minimize our contributions to the outcome and the consequences. And this is called self-serving bias.
Okay, it's sort of self-protective, isn't it?
It is, yeah. It's like, if you like it, I did it. If you don't like it, I had nothing to do with it. But it is, and they've actually done studies in schools, and from both the perspective of students and from teachers. And if a student does well, this was one study in a math class, I think. If the student did well, the teacher thought that it was as a result of their good teaching and good instruction. And if the student did poorly, it was because they didn't try, they didn't do the work.
They weren't motivated.
They weren't motivated. They didn't they didn't do their part of the learning experience. And from the perspective of students, they thought if they did well, it had to do with their work. And if they did poorly, it was because they had a bad teacher. So it can be from any perspective about anything. If for instance, if you're giving a presentation and it's well received, you could think, I'm a great presenter. I'm a wonderful public speaker. If people are restless or it doesn't go well, you don't get good feedback, you could say, well, the venue was not up to par, or it was, the lighting was poor, the sound system was bad, or we didn't have coffee and people were, you could say it wasn't about me, it was about other things. So that's the self-serving bias. We make assumptions about the consequences and outcomes of things based on, again, our comfort level with the situation.
And there might be, I'm assuming, a particle of truth to some of it. But if we operate on the whole assumption that it was because of what I did, it could take us off in a very dysfunctional direction. And we could repeat mistakes over and over again, thinking we're doing the right thing.
Right. You're not available for a deeper, broader explanation.
And learning.
And learning, right.
Yeah.
And in the case of the attribution error, it's you aren't interested in other people's story. Or again, if you're explaining your bad behavior away, you're not willing to change and look and reflect about yourself. There's yet a third way of kind of demonstrating through a really nice graphic, something called the ladder of inference. And I think we have a slide to go with this. Maybe they can find that. Peter Senge, in his work, references Chris Argerlis, I think. And he had a theory about how we interpret our observations.
So it's how we get to that point.
Yeah, and at the bottom of the ladder, we are just observing data, as if you're watching a movie. And so then you take in the data and you prune some of it away and you keep some because you're trying to make meaning. So just like we do with everything else, this is relevant, this is not, so I'm going to keep that. And then you assign meaning to it, much like we were talking about in the fundamental attribution error. That's going to be based on my previous experiences, my expectations, whatever my in-group practices. And then as you move up the ladder, I'm going to make assumptions based on that meaning about someone's motivations. And then I'm going to draw a conclusion. And then I'm going to adopt a belief. And then I'm going to act on that. And as you climb the ladder of assumptions, it's becoming more and more abstract and perhaps diluted and away from the actual observable behavior and data that you started with. But yet here you are climbing this ladder and behaving in reaction to all of the assumptions that you made at each rung. And that can get us into trouble too.
We've referenced that in past shows in terms of the conflict cycle.
Exactly.
That very
yeah.
process occurring in two people at the same time.
Yeah.
And how that carries them into false assumptions,
And
motivations,
behaviors,
and they react to that, and on it goes.
Right. Well, and the latter of assumptions might be describing and amplifying what we have talked about on one side of that conflict, where something happens that's a trigger, and that you interpret it, and then you think about it, and then you have a feeling about it, or a feeling, and you think about it, and then you act.
Right. It's interesting in that progression of the latter too, because at first you just see something, and that's the data, and then you begin to form some meaning, and then we begin to get selective in what data we pay attention to, and it gets narrower and narrower.
Narrower and narrower, and it can also become in a loop. The selection of data is influenced by your belief system. And sometimes we call it confirmation bias. And we only highlight the information that's congruent and that ratifies what we already believe about
and we
somebody.
ignore the rest of the data.
And then we discard the rest. So it can really be, it can cause conflict if we're not aware of it, and if we don't interrupt, and if we don't test in certain areas. We could look back and say, what else might have been observable that I didn't catch up with at the very beginning, at the very bottom, when I was taking in information? And then as you climb, we could ask ourselves, is there another interpretation of this? Instead of jumping to that quick conclusion. What assumptions might I have made about this event? And are my beliefs about this experience informing my optics and what I'm picking and choosing to just kind of, this is perpetual.
There's a lot of self-awareness and mindfulness that has to be, and is that something that's just taught then, that we learn to do that, or is there a technique for doing that?
Well, I think what we're trying to do today is just to say, be aware of this. Be aware that this is a human tendency. I think that it's biological in that these platforms or paradigms helped us survive, but they may not be as helpful now in 2022. We're not fighting the jungle as much as we are deadlines and promises and things like that, and that it can get us into trouble.
I'm thinking too, if we had strong messages from our parents, that for them might have been very true, but in today's society, not so much so.
But that's handed down into our belief system, which may inform what we choose to include in our information.
If we just absorb it without checking that out, it could put us in conflict with other people.
So we talked about being late, and how that could be interpreted, and that could happen to any. That could happen in a social setting. That could happen in a romantic setting. That could happen in a business setting, and we might jump to conclusions about why somebody was late without testing it, and then start treating them or believing that they are a certain kind of person. Whereas when I'm late, it's like I have these good reasons. Another example, like in a classroom or in the boardroom, if you're presenting and you see that person on their phone or fidgeting or yawning, what might you conclude?
Right, that they're just not interested, that I'm not doing well, that they're ignorant, that they're rude.
Or that they think they're above whatever this
or they
is.
came from a poor upbringing, they don't know better.
They don't have any etiquette, they're just...
I had a situation like that actually happened when I was doing a lecture, and a person sitting right in the front row was just doing sketches, never made eye contact, just sketching, sketching, sketching. And this went on the whole time. And later on, at least she was sensitive enough to come up to me and say, I just want you to know that you probably saw me sketching and everything, but that's the way I can pay attention. And I had no idea, because I was beginning to react to this as, you know, how dare you, sit in the front row and do this blatantly in front of me? And yet there was a whole different reason for it. Once I understood that, then I came down that ladder of inference of what I was assuming.
There's a bigger story.
Yeah,
this
there was
is
a story there.
A coping mechanism for somebody who may not be able to focus otherwise. I've been in meetings where people will be doing handwork or knitting or something, and I think, you know, I sure would like to be doing something else at the same time, but I'm here giving my full attention. But I've come to understand that some people need to have that so that they can focus their attention. The person yawning could have a legitimate reason for being tired, or that it might be an emergency phone call. There are other plausible explanations if we stop and don't rush to judgment. I think we rush to judgment, and we think that we're so clairvoyant. You know, we know without a doubt why somebody's doing something, and we really don't.
We talked again about that in a previous show, about how our emotions trigger things for us. So that's usually the first thing that we might be aware of is, ooh, that doesn't feel right, or how dare you, that type of thing. It's an emotional reaction. Then we start up the ladder of trying to interpret why. What's the story behind that? And that's where the error can be made very quickly without making contact with that person in some way, trying to figure out where they're coming from. Right,
or checking in with somebody else that you trust and saying, you know, this is what happened. Can you I just want to check in to make sure that I'm being rational. No, and explain it.
Right, a friend could be very helpful in helping to look at other possibilities.
You could be, you could rush to judgment in a partnership, in a domestic partnership, where somebody's let you down and they haven't done something that is like within their purview of doing. It's like, really? You couldn't even fill in the blank, get the lawn mowed, finish the laundry, do the dishes. You didn't get, you know, whatever in your sharing of responsibilities. And you could immediately, you know, start attacking that person's character, saying, I can never depend on you. You're unreliable. You're this. But you know, maybe there's another story.
Right. I'm thinking as you're explaining this, how comedy sometimes is based on those assumptions.
On those assumptions, yes.
Those errors, and it becomes funny because the audience begins to see how that error is making really problems for the person.
It's funny if there's an omniscient third party, like an audience. It's not funny when there's a misconnection between two parties, because they start to behave based on their assumptions and based on their conclusions that, you know, you knew I was going to be tired and you didn't have dinner ready, or you knew I was going on a trip and you didn't clean the car, or, you know, I've promised to do things, and sometimes I like to think that I try to keep my promises. I haven't been able to live up to it because things have happened. And again, we don't afford other people the same courtesy of a larger story.
We almost let our emotions of resentment, frustration, disappointment run away with us.
And it's because we do make inferences, we do make assumptions. It's built into our biology, because
we're looking for that logic.
We are,
and the explanation.
There are times when a split-second decision about something can mean getting out of danger or being in danger. But these social interactions generally don't fit into that, but we are prone to still making snap judgments.
Right. Especially if you consistently make that same judgment with a person over and over again over a period of time, I would think it could do quite a bit of damage to a relationship.
Or you could start treating somebody differently based on all of this internal stuff that you've done, either on that ladder of inference or a quick superficial judgment. And they don't even have the benefit of the doubt of your thinking because it's been invisible. You know, that's another way that you could kind of unpack this, is that you could make your thinking visible to the person.
Right.
And it's another way to test. It's like, so, and even in an I statement, we've talked about I statements in the past, like, when this happens, this is how I feel, or this is what it makes me feel. I'm wondering if,
Right.
and that could open the conversation to that person and say, whoa, 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 wait a minute, that's not what happened.
Right.
But we don't make our thinking visible.
And that's what we've talked about in the conflict cycle too, that it's a two-way responsibility here, that as you say, I'm making some faulty assumptions. And so I start changing my behavior a little bit. The other person is confused by the change of behavior, and therefore they change theirs too, based upon some faulty assumptions.
Motivate
so around and around we go.
It can disrupt that negativity.
Right.
It doesn't always, but it can shift it a little bit.
But one person opening up and sharing what they're experiencing could change that whole picture and bring people actually closer together.
So I think what we're trying to say today is that these are human tendencies. Over and over, researchers see patterns. We are, our tendency is to fall into those grooves of how to behave. We're asking ourselves and our viewers to just be aware of that, test your assumptions, make your thinking visible. Go back to your observable data and, like, in that original situation, is there something I missed? Is there another meaning that I could have attributed to what I think I saw or experienced? And give that other person the benefit of the doubt. You might be right.
Yeah,
But there's as much a chance that you are not. And it can get us into traps and into bad cycles. And
I would think too, as parents, this would be something, a process that would be very good to share with your child. And when we do make a false assumption about why a child did something, that we can do the apology if necessary, and ask for clarification, which models for the child the very thing we're talking about. Check things out before you make assumptions.
And that's a good skill to offer them, not only building your relationship, but the relationship that they will have with other people. And when you go back and talk about generational differences, the same behavior now may have meant something different in the generation of the parents. So that is a really good, there's a bigger schism, I think, there than in some other groups with that generational thing. So what are you assuming? Think about it, and we hope to see you again soon on the next episode of the Relationship Toolbox.